Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the shimmering world of ancient China's clothing traditions, and it all starts with a single, silken thread. Imagine sitting in a quiet garden, cicadas buzzing in the background, when a mulberry leaf wiggles in the breeze. You pluck it, curious, and out wriggles a silkworm, munching away. Its cocoon glistens like a pearl, fragile yet hiding something miraculous inside. This is the moment that would eventually wrap emperors in garments so precious that entire empires guarded the secret. And let's be real, if you were caught smuggling silkworm eggs out of China in those days, you probably wouldn't survive the gentle punishment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the time where you are down in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean in closer, and suddenly, you're in the Neolithic villages of China. Simple huts surround you, smoke curling from clay ovens. Here, people wear rough hemp and ramie fibers, stiff against the skin, scratchy and far from glamorous. But one day, legend says, Empress Lezu sits beneath a mulberry tree when a cocoon drops into her teacup. Instead of tossing it aside, she tugs at the sticky thread, and it keeps unraveling, longer and longer, a single strand stretching endlessly. Historians still argue whether this charming tale has a shred of truth or whether it's just embroidered myth, but either way, the Chinese mastered silk production thousands of years before anyone else. You try to imagine wrapping yourself in silk for the first time. It clings cool against your skin, almost slippery, shining faintly even in firelight. Compared to hemp, it's like trading a sandpaper towel for a luxury bedsheet. This fabric doesn't just protect you from the chill, it whispers wealth, status, even cosmic order. Silk is soon linked with the divine, the shimmering sheen becomes a metaphor for heavenly radiance. By the Shang dynasty, you shuffle past nobles in shimmering tunics that flow like water, while ordinary folk still itch in their hemp. The gap between fabrics mirrors the gap between classes. And here's a quirky tidbit, some early silk garments were buried with the dead, so the spirit would look presentable in the afterlife. Imagine explaining to your ghost friends that you're still rocking designer threads. The mulberry trees themselves become sacred guardians of fashion. Farmers carefully prune them, feeding their leaves to greedy silkworms, who spin themselves into luxury. You might picture little silkworm nurseries, clay rooms warm just enough for the larvae to munch happily. Entire households take part, children plucking leaves, elders reeling thread from boiling cocoons. Yes, you heard that right, cocoons were boiled, silkworms still inside, to preserve the thread. It's not exactly the bedtime snack you wanted, but it was efficient. Silk threads are twisted into yarn, dyed with plant-based colors, then woven into cloth that ranges from sheer gauze to thick brocade. Scholars still debate whether the earliest looms were borrowed inventions or uniquely Chinese innovations, but either way, you'd be hypnotized by the click-clack rhythm of wooden frames, as skilled hands guide shimmering threads into ordered beauty. At first, silk stays close to the ruling elite. You wouldn't dream of tossing on a silk tunic to farm millet. But as centuries pass, silk becomes both currency and diplomatic gift. You stumble across scrolls recording bolts of silk given to warriors as payment, or to neighboring rulers as peace offerings. One emperor even pays his troops in silk instead of coins. Try imagining your salary arriving as fancy fabric instead of a bank transfer. Silk isn't just clothing, it's a political tool, a bargaining chip, even a weapon. And because it's light but strong, soldiers use it for padded armor linings. In fact, silk could help slow down arrows, though don't get too excited. You probably wouldn't survive long in just a silk shirt if someone was aiming at you. But back in your soft focus vision, you picture walking down a Shang-era street, sunlight catching robes that gleam faintly gold, red, or green. Colors carry meaning, red for luck, black for solemnity, white for mourning. Already, fabric isn't just fabric, it's language, coded in threads. You tug at your sleeve and realize you're speaking in a dialect of style. silk making becomes so vital to China that strict punishments guard the secret. For centuries, only China knows how to breed silkworms, reel thread, and weave the luminous cloth. Other civilizations can only gape in envy when Chinese envoys arrive in shimmering robes. Romans later call it woven winds and fork over obscene amounts of gold for it. You can almost see a Roman senator clutching a translucent robe, scandalized at how see-through it is, muttering something about degeneracy, while secretly slipping it into his shopping bag. The early centuries of silk are a blend of legend, labor, and luxury. You feel the paradox, peasants bending over mulberry orchards, sweating under the sun, so their emperor can glide across jade floors in shimmering robes. It's not exactly fair, but it sets the stage for a fashion story that lasts millennia. By now, your skin is cloaked in threads that started in a tiny worm's mouth, a whisper of light that somehow connects you to power, to myth, to survival. You can't help but wonder if, somewhere, one of those worms is still a little salty about being boiled for your bedtime outfit. You stand in the dawn mist of the Han Dynasty, watching a procession of officials march stiffly toward the imperial court. Their robes swish against the stone floor in layers so voluminous they practically mop the ground. One wrong step and you're tangling yourself like a kid caught in their mom's curtains. But these robes are more than fabric, they're choreography. Every fold, every sleeve, every tie announces rank, duty, and dignity. You're not just dressed, you're scripted. The Han Dynasty, lasting from 206 BCE to 220 CE, is where clothing becomes a political performance. You notice the robes, long gowns with wide sleeves, fastened with sashes at the waist. The basic cut is simple, almost like a T-shape, but the layering transforms it into something theatrical. Historians still argue whether Han clothing was more about ritual formality or about practical identity markers, but either way, you feel the weight of expectation tugging at your shoulders with every drape. Imagine slipping into one yourself, the underrobe of light hemp or silk first, then the outer garment, then maybe another on top if you're high-ranking enough. Sleeves extend well past your fingertips, so you have to lift your arms just to keep from tripping. Want to gesture during a speech? Forget subtle hand motions, you're basically waving flags. But that was the point, the grand sweep of a sleeve symbolized your cultivation, your status, your literal largeness in society. Now, here's the quirky tidbit, Han scholars often debated sleeve width like it was a national crisis. Too narrow. You're stingy and small-minded. Too wide. You're indulgent and sloppy. The sweet spot was an elegant flare, roomy but controlled, like the Goldilocks zone of fashion politics. Somewhere in a dusty Han academy, two old men probably spent an entire afternoon arguing about whether 6 inches or 8 inches of extra cloth made you morally superior. You shuffle further into the court, where colors also tell a story. Deep reds, purples, and blacks dominate official wear, symbolizing authority and cosmic alignment. Ordinary folks, meanwhile, are expected to keep it simple, earthy browns, pale whites, nothing that screams, "Look at me." If you dared to strut around in imperial yellow, you might find yourself invited to explain your fashion choices to a very unimpressed judge. Let's just say you probably wouldn't survive that wardrobe malfunction. The Han people believed clothing echoed the harmony of heaven and earth. Robes weren't stitched randomly, their designs embodied yin and yang, balance and order. Even the way you tied your sash mattered. Men usually knotted theirs to the right, women to the left. A tiny detail, but one that anchored your identity in fabric. You absent-mindedly tug at your sash, wondering if anyone's about to accuse you of tying it wrong. Now comes a debate still buzzing in scholarly circles, were Han robes inspired more by Zhou dynasty ritual clothing, or did they innovate entirely new styles? On one hand, the cuts and layering seem like a direct continuation. On the other, the Han introduced broader sleeves, more dramatic silhouettes, and stricter codifications of what to wear when. The argument continues like an endless fashion panel, except instead of Project Runway, it's Project Confucius. Speaking of Confucius, he looms over Han fashion like an invisible stylist. His philosophy stressed ritual propriety, which meant dressing appropriately was as moral as paying your taxes. If you showed up in the wrong robe at the wrong event, you weren't just unfashionable, you were unfilial, disloyal, possibly treasonous. Imagine your outfit choices carrying that much weight. Forget, does this make me look fat? It's more like, does this make me look like I'm undermining the emperor? And for daily life? Even non-elites copied the robe structure in simpler versions. Farmers, artisans, and merchants wore shorter robes tied tighter at the waist, sleeves rolled for practicality. The elegance of court fashion trickled down like hand-me-downs, except peasants made it work for mud, markets, and manual labor. It's a reminder that the silhouette, the wraparound robe, the tied sash, the flowing sleeve, defined Chinese clothing for centuries, from palace to pigsty. Here's your second quirky fact of the night. Some Han garments were so long they deliberately dragged behind the wearer. This wasn't laziness or poor tailoring, it was a power move. You showed you didn't need to hurry, didn't need to keep your clothes clean, because others would literally sweep up after you. It's fashion as the ultimate flex. You, meanwhile, are struggling not to step on your own hem. Textiles also bloom under the Han. Brocades with intricate patterns, clouds, dragons, phoenixes, appear, shimmering with symbolism. You run your fingers across the fabric, feeling tiny ridges where the weft threads shift color. Each design whispers something: dragons for imperial authority, clouds for heavenly favor, birds for longevity. It's clothing as billboard, except instead of advertising soda, it announces cosmic legitimacy. Now, picture the emperor himself. He sits on his throne in the Mianfu, the most formal robe, complete with a stiff crown dangling strings of jade beads in front of his face. You squint, wondering how he even sees. Maybe that's the point, it forces him to keep his gaze lowered, reminding him to act humbly. Of course, whether emperors actually acted humble is, well, historians still argue whether the symbolism worked in practice. As you watch the court shuffle and bow, you notice the rhythm, wide sleeves rising like wings, hems brushing the marble, sashes swaying. It's hypnotic, like a choreographed dance of hierarchy. Each step reinforces who belongs where. You realize that in Han China, you don't just wear clothes wear you, guiding your movements, framing your body, dictating your life. And as the silk whispers around your arms, you can't help but smirk. Somewhere in the shadows, a tailor is probably giggling at the idea that sleeve width once determined your worth as a human being. Ancient fashion, it seems, had no chill. You fidget with the long robe wrapped around you, realizing that without something to hold it together, the entire outfit would collapse like a badly pitched tent. That's where belts, sashes, and ties enter the story, small details that do far more than keep your pants up. In ancient China, these weren't just accessories, they were status markers, storage solutions, and sometimes even survival gear. You tug at a sash and suddenly feel the weight of a hidden pouch thump against your hip, because yes, pockets weren't a thing yet, but people still needed somewhere to stash their goodies. The simplest fastening starts with the dye, a cloth sash. You wrap it once, twice around your waist, knotting it firmly. It holds your layers in place, keeps your sleeves from sliding too far, and gives you a bit of structure under all that fabric. Peasants wear rough hemp versions, maybe dyed a dull brown or gray. Nobles, meanwhile, flaunt wide silk sashes, embroidered with clouds, dragons, or geometric patterns. The difference is obvious. One says, "I spent the morning hauling buckets," the other whispers, "I command people who haul buckets for me." Over time, the sash evolves into the belt, often made of leather. And here's the quirky tidbit: early belts sometimes had decorative plaques, bronze, jade, even gold, clipped across the front. These weren't just for show, they jingled and flashed as you walked, like ancient bling. Historians still argue whether the belt plaques had deeper symbolic meaning or if they were just really expensive noisemakers, but either way, you can't miss the sparkle. Practicality sneaks in too. Without sewn-in pockets, people tied small pouches, knives, or tools directly to their belts. Picture a Han merchant patting his waist, making sure his coin purse is still dangling there. Or a soldier fastening a dagger close at hand, the leather creaking as he shifts. You lean down and notice that even kids wore little pouches tied at the hip, sometimes filled with herbs meant to repel evil spirits. Forget fidget spinners, this was your everyday charm against bad vibes. Another clever twist, knots themselves were often decorative. Some were tied in patterns meant to symbolize good luck, longevity, or prosperity. You'd glance at someone's sash and read it like a fortune cookie. One knot might mean, safe travels, another, wealth is coming. Think of it as emoji tied into fabric, ancient texting before texting existed. And belts weren't only about holding things up. They could literally signal your place in the world. In certain dynasties, officials had strict regulations about what material or color their belts could be. White leather might mark a military man, while jade ornaments denoted high civil rank. If you wore the wrong belt in the wrong hall, you weren't just committing a fashion faux pas, you were committing political suicide. You probably wouldn't survive the emperor's version of a dress code violation. The scholar officials of the Han loved to show off with ornate girdles, sometimes so stiff they forced their wearers to stand ramrod straight. You try one on and realize you can't bend over to pick up a dropped scroll. Maybe that was intentional. The straighter your posture, the nobler your character, at least in theory. Whether these belts actually made anyone more virtuous, historians still argue whether moral strength can really come from lumbar support. Meanwhile, peasants kept it practical. A farmer ties his hemp sash tight, tucks in a sickle, and wades into the fields. His wife might knot hers in a way that lets her hang a spindle of thread or a tiny pouch of sewing needles. The belts are humble, unornamented, and yet they're lifelines, both hands free while tools swing at the hip. You picture bending to weed a rice paddy, your belt squeaking as it digs into your waist, not glamorous but reliable. Here's a fun twist, belts sometimes doubled as makeshift measuring tapes. Need to check grain storage? Count the wraps of your sash against the jar. One anecdote tells of a scholar who supposedly judged the worth of his servants by whether they tied their sashes neatly or sloppily. Imagine your boss inspecting your belt not before deciding if you're good at your job. By the Tang dynasty, things get even flashier. Belts widen into fashion statements, sometimes stiffened with layers of fabric and leather, encrusted with gilt bronze fittings. The jingle of plaques at a banquet becomes as much about showing off as sipping wine. It's a soundscape of hierarchy, the richer you are, the louder your waist announces it. Meanwhile, courtiers are quietly trying to one-up each other with bigger, shinier belt ornaments, like a medieval version of, who has the latest iPhone. Even in religious settings, belts had a role. Taoist priests fastened their robes with symbolic knots, thought to mirror the tying together of cosmic forces. Buddhist monks wore simpler girdles, the knot serving as a reminder of humility and discipline. You bow with your own sash digging into your waist and wonder if enlightenment feels slightly like being cinched by a stubborn drawstring. And because ancient fashion always finds a way to blend the sacred with the silly, some folks wore little perfume sachets tied to their belts. These weren't just for smelling nice, they were thought to protect against illness or bad spirits. Picture leaning over to shake someone's hand and suddenly your belt wafts a cloud of clove or sandalwood into their face. It's both charming and a little obnoxious. By the end of your stroll through belt history, you realize something important. For all the silk and shimmering robes, it's the humble sash that actually keeps everything together, literally and symbolically. Without it, robes fall, tools scatter, and identity blurs. You give your own knot a final tug and smirk, half expecting someone to compliment you on your emoji-level knotting skills. You pause in the shadow of a carved palace gate and notice that not all colors are created equal here. The Han robes you've been swishing around in suddenly feel risky, because color is more than fashion, it's politics, cosmic law, and sometimes the line between safety and punishment. You glance down at your sleeve, wondering if tonight's shade is a death sentence or just a bold fashion choice. In ancient China, color carried deep symbolic weight. It wasn't just about looking good in sunlight, it was about aligning yourself with the rhythms of heaven and earth. Dynasties actually picked cosmic colors, tied to the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Each dynasty claimed one element and its corresponding hue as the official tone of its rule. For example, the Han leaned toward black and red, linking their authority to cosmic fire and renewal. You look around and realize every robe in the court is essentially propaganda stitched in dye. Here's the quirky tidbit: yellow, which today might just remind you of emojis or smiley faces, was once so sacred it was reserved exclusively for the emperor. To strut around in imperial yellow without permission was basically an open challenge to the throne. And you probably wouldn't survive that particular runway show. Imagine being arrested for wearing a sunshine-colored hoodie. It's absurd, but in ancient China, that splash of dye was treason. Historians still argue whether color bans were strictly enforced in daily life or mostly symbolic guidelines. On the one hand, archaeological finds show a range of colors even in common graves. On the other, court records thunder about strict penalties for presumptuous hues. Maybe the emperor's guards weren't raiding every dye pot, but flaunting forbidden shades in public would have been like waving a neon sign that read, "Execute me." Different colors carried layered meanings. Red was vibrant, lucky, and full of yang energy, perfect for weddings, rituals, and anything that needed extra zest. Even today, you can see red woven into Chinese New Year, a callback thousands of years old. White, by contrast, was associated with mourning and death. You wrap yourself in a pale robe and suddenly feel the weight of grief, the hush of funerals. Wearing white to a festival would have been like showing up in funeral garb to a birthday party, not a great move. Black, too, was double-edged. For commoners, it could mean humility and simplicity, while in court contexts, it symbolized authority and strength. Some dynasties even decreed black as the official dress for officials. You tug at a black sash and wonder if it makes you look powerful or just like you're on your way to a very grim dinner party. Green and blue often suggested growth, spring, and renewal, colors of youth and vibrancy. Children's clothes sometimes lean toward these shades, paired with protective charms sewn into the fabric. It's almost like dressing kids in fluorescent safety jackets today, except the goal was to fool evil spirits, not traffic. Then there's purple, the eternal social climber of colors. It wasn't as exalted as imperial yellow, but it was costly to produce, requiring rare dyes. That expense alone made it prestigious. In some dynasties, only high officials could flaunt purple, turning the color into a shortcut for status. You imagine two nobles glaring at each other across a banquet, both draped in slightly different shades of violet, arguing over who has the truer purple. Dyes themselves came from the natural world, and you can smell them if you lean close. Red from madder roots, yellow from gardenia blossoms, black from soot or charred plants. Indigo, of course, from the indigofera plant, staining fingers deep blue during the dyeing process. Some early texts even describe alchemists experimenting with minerals and metallic salts to expand the palette. Picture an ancient scientist holding up a streak of experimental dye, muttering, too streaky, before tossing it back into the cauldron. Clothing color also changed with life stages and ceremonies. Newborns sometimes wore red swaddles, brides glided in scarlet gowns, and mourners cloaked themselves in austere white or hemp-colored robes. It was like a life calendar stitched in color. You always knew what someone was experiencing by the hue of their sleeves. Imagine if today's clothing worked the same way: neon pink hoodies for recently engaged, gray sweatpants for grieving. Society would be a lot easier to read at a glance. Of course, not everyone agreed on what each shade meant. Some texts claim black was the color of dignity, others sneer at it as plain. Some poets swooned over the elegance of pale green, while others mocked it as rustic. Historians still argue whether these variations reflect regional traditions or evolving symbolism. It's a reminder that fashion never stays still, even when it pretends to be timeless. The emperor's wardrobe was the most color-coded of all. He rotated through certain hues depending on the season, ritual, or cosmic alignment. Spring might demand green for growth, summer red for fire, autumn white for metal, winter black for water. You picture him standing before a closet the size of a warehouse, muttering, which cosmic force am I today, and pulling out a robe like it's a mystical mood ring. As you wander through the palace halls, you catch glimpses of silk panels fluttering with dyes so rich they almost glow in candlelight. The colors aren't just decoration, they're codes, prayers, warnings. And you, tugging nervously at your sleeve, realize that one careless choice could send the wrong message entirely. It makes you smile, though, to think how timeless the obsession with color really is. Whether it's arguing over sleeve width, belt plaques, or the right shade of purple, humans have always turned fabric into a battlefield of meaning. You might not survive a yellow robe in Han China, but at least you'd look fabulous on the way out. Your feet ache from standing so long in silk robes, and that's when you start noticing what people are wearing down below. Footwear, humble and often overlooked, was just as much a marker of class and identity in ancient China as robes and sashes. You lower your gaze and find yourself walking through centuries of shifting soles, from scratchy straw sandals to embroidered silk slippers soft enough to make you float. At the very bottom of the ladder, peasants trudged in shoes woven from straw or reeds. You slide one on and instantly feel every pebble poking through. Not exactly supportive, but cheap, breathable, and easy to replace. A farmer could braid a new pair in a single evening, though you'd probably end up with blisters before you'd even finished threshing your grain. The upside? Straw sandals dried quickly in the sun after slogging through muddy rice paddies. The downside? One misstep in a downpour and you're basically wearing soggy compost on your feet. By contrast, wealthier folk wore shoes of cloth, often hemp or cotton, stitched with thick soles. Some were plain, but others had decorative stitching, clouds, flowers, or geometric patterns. Silk shoes emerged for the elite, glowing softly under lantern light. You slip your feet into a pair and suddenly every step is cushioned, smooth, almost too precious for walking. You'd rather hover in place and let people come to you. Historians still argue whether these fragile silk shoes were meant more for practical use or for ceremonial show, but either way, they weren't built for hiking up mountains. Then there were boots. Leather boots appear in frontier regions, worn by soldiers and riders thundering across the steppes. Imagine stomping in tall boots, your calves wrapped tight, dust kicking up behind you. Unlike floppy straw sandals, these offered grip and ankle support. The quirky tidbit here, some Han generals supposedly believed their boots absorbed the spirit of past battles, making them more battle-ready. A little superstitious, but hey, you'd want all the help you could get when arrows were flying. Court life, of course, demanded something different. Officials often wore black cloth shoes with slightly upturned toes, their shape elongating the stride and looking elegant when gliding across polished floors. These shoes weren't just footwear, they were choreography again, teaching you how to walk, bow, and stand still with poise. Try running in them, though, and you'd probably faceplant within seconds. Colors and materials also played into hierarchy. Silk shoes dyed red or green might belong to aristocrats, while officials stuck with black for solemnity. Children sometimes wore bright embroidered slippers with animal motifs, tigers or fish, meant to confuse evil spirits into leaving them alone. You glance at a toddler waddling by in tiger head shoes, the cloth ears flopping adorably, and can't help but laugh. It's like dressing your kid in protective cosplay. Some shoes even carried symbolic stitching. Lotus blossoms for purity, cranes for longevity, bats for good fortune. Your feet became walking billboards of blessings. You picture shuffling through the marketplace, every passerby subtly advertising their aspirations through their shoes. Forget bumper stickers, these were ancient hashtags, embroidered right on your toes. Of course, footwear could also get downright impractical. During certain dynasties, nobles wore platform-style shoes, lifting them higher off the ground. The extra height was meant to symbolize authority and separation from the dirt of the world. But walking in them, you wobble like you're on stilts, desperately trying not to topple. Imagine needing servants to steady you just to get from your throne to the banquet table. Not exactly a graceful flex. For soldiers, boots weren't just symbolic. They were survival gear. Archaeological finds show sturdy leather-soled boots, thickly layered to endure long marches. Some even had hobnail-style studs hammered into the bottom for traction. Slip your foot into one and suddenly you're grounded, stable, ready to march across gravel, mud, or snow. Compare that to the straw sandal, and you understand instantly why soldiers needed sturdier gear. You probably wouldn't survive a border campaign in soggy straw footwear. And footwear wasn't only about walking, it could be ritual. In some ceremonies, participants removed shoes to show humility before deities or ancestors. In others, special embroidered slippers were worn only once, then placed with the deceased in their tombs. Imagine slipping into silk shoes for the first time, knowing you'll never wear them again because they're destined for eternity underground. Historians still argue whether the shoe styles we see in paintings reflect daily wear or just ceremonial ideals. Did nobles really shuffle around their estates in delicate silk slippers every day, or did they switch to sturdier shoes once the artists left? The evidence is patchy, but the tension between practicality and display shows up everywhere. As you walk through the imagined streets of Han Chang'an, you hear the shuffle of straw, the slap of cloth soles, the thump of boots. Each sound signals class, purpose, and destiny. A farmer's shoes squelch in mud, a scholar's tread whispers across stone, a soldier's boots drum like war approaching. You start noticing footwear not as an afterthought, but as the first clue to who someone is. You glance at your own shoes, half straw, half silk in this dreamscape, and chuckle. Somewhere in ancient China, a tailor would be scandalized by your fashion confusion. But at least your feet are comfortable, which, let's be honest, is the ultimate victory in any era. You tilt your head back, and suddenly your gaze climbs past robes and sashes all the way to the crowning glory of ancient fashion, what people wore on their heads. Hats, crowns, and hairpins weren't just pretty toppers, they were loaded with symbolism, authority, and sometimes enough weight to give you a permanent neck ache. You adjust the imaginary piece on your head and realize, this is where status literally sat. For everyday folks, hats were practical. Farmers tied on simple cloth caps or bamboo hats with wide brims, shielding their eyes from glaring sun. You slip one on and instantly feel the relief of shade. Cheap, breathable, replaceable, these hats were the sunscreen of their time, minus the crocodile dung recipes you may remember from earlier adventures. They kept sweat dripping down into the fields, not your eyes. But in court, things escalated quickly. Officials wore structured hats, often with stiff panels sticking out at odd angles. The most famous is the futu, a black gauze cap with wing-like flaps jutting from the sides. At first glance, it looks like you're wearing a pair of mini airplane wings on your head. The quirky tidbit? Those wings weren't just decorative. They supposedly discouraged officials from whispering too closely during court sessions. With flaps extending sideways, you physically couldn't lean in without bonking heads. Ancient fashion, now with built-in anti-gossip features. Crowns, of course, were reserved for emperors and royalty. The most formal crown was the mian, a flat-topped headdress with strings of jade beads dangling in front and back. You slip it on and immediately discover the problem. You can't see clearly because beads sway into your eyes. But that was the point. The dangling gems forced the emperor to keep his gaze lowered, projecting humility, even if humility wasn't exactly his daily vibe. Historians still argue whether emperors actually wore these heavy crowns regularly or saved them for big ceremonies, but either way, they were as much philosophy as fashion. Women's headgear was no less fascinating. Hairpins, known as zan or ji, weren't just about securing buns, they were canvases for artistry. Jade, gold, silver, even carved bone formed delicate sticks topped with flowers, birds, or phoenixes. Some pins were so elaborate they jingled when the wearer walked, tiny pendants chiming softly like wind chimes. You imagine turning your head too fast and accidentally smacking someone with your phoenix pin, glamorous, but also slightly hazardous. Hairpins also had symbolic meaning. A single pin might mark a coming-of-age ceremony for a young woman. Breaking one in half could symbolize a vow, like promising to reunite with someone in the future. You run your fingers across a polished jade pin and realize it's more than ornament, it's contract, memory, promise. No wonder people treasured them enough to be buried with them. And then there were extravagant headdresses. During the Tang dynasty, noblewomen sometimes wore towering structures of fabric, jewels, and hairpieces that reached almost comical heights. You balance one precariously on your head and wobble like you're carrying a small pagoda. Servants probably had to help secure it in place, layering hair with wax, pins, and silk ribbons until it was less style and more architecture. For military men, helmets told their own story. Leather caps, bronze fittings, even ornate crests made soldiers look taller, fiercer. Some helmets had plume-like decorations, bright feathers meant to intimidate enemies. You tug one on and instantly feel sweaty, claustrophobic, but also oddly invincible. A bit like modern cosplay, except your life actually depended on the intimidation factor. What fascinates you most, though, is how these accessories acted like billboards. A crown screamed, "I am heaven's chosen." A scholar's cap whispered, "I belong to the bureaucracy." A hairpin shimmered, "I'm of marriageable age." Even a farmer's bamboo hat said, "I work with the earth." Every hat or pin was part of the silent conversation of society. The quirky fringe detail here, some superstitious folks believed certain hairpins could double as protective talismans. A pin shaped like a tiger or dragon wasn't just decorative, it was supposed to fend off spirits hovering around the household. Imagine sleeping with a dragon pin tucked into your bun, convinced it's scaring off invisible gremlins in the corner. And yet, for all the stiff crowns and precarious headdresses, common sense prevailed in daily life. Most people just tied their hair up with simple bands, used modest pins, or wore cloth wraps. The fancy stuff came out for ceremonies, weddings, or the rare chance to impress someone at court. You probably wouldn't survive a day of farming with 10 pounds of jade dangling from your scalp. Historians still argue whether the futa cap, with its comical wings, was truly effective as anti-whisper tech or just a symbolic gesture. Did courtiers really keep their distance, or did they sneak around the wings anyway? We'll never know for sure, but the idea makes you smile. Fashion as social engineering, it's brilliant and a little ridiculous. As you walk away, the beads of an emperor's crown sway against your cheeks, the phoenix pins tinkle behind your ears, and the brim of a farmer's hat shields your eyes. You realize that in ancient China, status wasn't just stitched into your robe, it perched right on top of your head. And sometimes, it made you look a little like you were about to take flight. You march forward now, your silken sleeves traded for something far heavier. Instead of the soft whisper of fabric, you hear the clank of metal plates and the creak of leather straps. Welcome to the world of soldiers and guards, where fashion was less about impressing neighbors and more about surviving sharp, pointy objects flying your way. You flex your shoulders beneath the weight and wonder how anyone moved quickly in this stuff. Spoiler, they didn't. Early Chinese soldiers wore armor made from leather, tough, boiled, and sometimes lacquered to resist weather. Imagine thick leather coats with overlapping scales stitched tightly together. You run your fingers along the ridges, and it feels like stroking a reptile's hide. The upside? It protected against arrows and glancing blows. The downside? Sweat. Buckets of it. You're basically walking around in a sauna with straps. You probably wouldn't last long in July unless you had an unlimited supply of watermelons to keep you cool. As dynasties rose and technology improved, armor evolved. By the Warring States period, bronze scales entered the scene, followed later by iron. Picture small rectangular plates, punched with holes, then laced together with leather thongs like a very heavy patchwork quilt. You strap one on, and it feels clunky but oddly secure. The armor covers your torso, sometimes your shoulders, and in elite cases, even your thighs. But don't get too excited, your legs are still prime targets. Soldiers had to hope the enemy aimed elsewhere. Historians still argue whether the scale pattern was more about appearance than maximum efficiency, since some surviving sets look almost decorative. Were generals showing off at the risk of slower mobility? Probably. Helmets completed the look, bronze or iron caps with nose guards, sometimes topped with horsehair plumes. You place one on your head, and suddenly you feel taller, fiercer, like a rooster puffing up to scare rivals. That plume isn't just for show, it's psychological warfare. From a distance, soldiers looked like a sea of bristling giants. But let's be honest, one gust of wind and everyone's rooster feathers went sideways. Not so intimidating after all. Then there were the guards of the palace. Unlike battlefield soldiers, these men needed to look sharp as well as ready. Their uniforms blended practicality with theater, bright fabrics, embroidered insignia, and belts heavy with decorative yet functional weapons. You stride through a palace gate wearing one of these uniforms, feeling half warrior, half fashion model. A commoner looking at you would know immediately, this wasn't a man to argue with. Even if your sleeves were embroidered with dragons that looked suspiciously like fat snakes. Quirky detail time. Some sources suggest certain guards were required to maintain specific facial hairstyles as part of their uniform. Imagine being told you're out of regulation because your mustache curled the wrong way. Facial fashion as state security, what a concept. Weapons, of course, were accessories in their own right. The jian, straight sword, the dao, saber, and long halberds weren't just tools, they signaled rank. Officers carried beautifully inlaid swords with jade or bronze fittings. You tug one from its sheath and feel its balance hum in your palm. Foot soldiers, by contrast, might wield clunkier versions or simple spears. And then there were crossbows, the ancient world's version of terrifying modern tech. A guard with a crossbow strapped to his back. Instant authority. The daily experience of wearing soldier's gear was far less glamorous. Armor restricted your breathing, rubbed sores into your shoulders, and made sitting down a comedy act. You squat and immediately topple like a turtle flipped on its shell. Ancient Chinese generals didn't need gym memberships, their workout was simply existing in full kit for hours. Yet, despite the heaviness, soldiers sometimes added a splash of flair. Colored cloth ties, patterned surcoats worn over armor, even animal motifs engraved on metal plates. A breastplate might feature a tiger's snarl or a dragon curling across it. Protective magic. Intimidation factor. Or just because someone thought, yeah, this looks badass. Historians still argue whether those designs held ritual power or were just ancient doodles gone fancy. Interestingly, not all armor was designed to last through real combat. Ceremonial sets, often lacquered in brilliant reds, decorated with gold studs, or even carved wood, were made for parades, funerals, or burials. You peer at one in a museum and realize, no one could survive a battlefield in this, it's cosplay, ancient edition. Even the terracotta army in Xi'an sports stylized armor that looks protective but probably wouldn't stop a determined goose, let alone an enemy spear. The sensory experience is undeniable. Leather straps dig into your skin. Your helmet clangs when you tilt your head too quickly. Dust settles into every crease of your quilted jacket. You smell metal, sweat, and smoke from the campfire blending into one unforgettable soldier's perfume. And yet, somehow, you feel safer wrapped in these layers, as if society itself has strapped protection onto your back. Of course, armor was expensive. Common soldiers often wore minimal gear, padded cloth vests, maybe a leather shield if lucky. Peasants conscripted into armies might fight in little more than hemp tunics and bravado. Meanwhile, generals paraded around in gleaming suits of scale, looking like walking treasure chests. The inequality was visible in every polished plate. You wipe sweat from your brow and adjust your helmet, trying not to think about how heavy your gear feels. Around you, the rhythmic sound of armor clanking fills the air, an orchestra of protection and exhaustion. Guards stand straighter as nobles pass, soldiers shift uneasily on the march, and everyone secretly dreams of ditching their kit for the light comfort of silk robes. By the end of the day, you understand, clothing for soldiers and guards wasn't about elegance. It was about visibility, intimidation, and survival. Every flap of your cloak, every clank of your armor, every gleam of your sword announced your role in society. And sometimes, it also announced just how sweaty you were under all that impressive metal. You loosen the weight of armor from your shoulders and step back into the rhythm of ordinary life. Suddenly, silk, gold pins, and jeweled crowns vanish, and you find yourself staring at the patched tunics of peasants. This is where most people lived, in scratchy fabric, bare feet, and clothes designed not for ceremony but for pure survival. You tug on a coarse hemp shirt, and instantly, your skin prickles as if you're wearing sandpaper. Congratulations, you've just joined the majority of ancient China's population. Peasant wear was almost always practical. Hemp and ramie were the main fibers, tough and durable, able to withstand long days of farm labor. Cotton didn't become widespread until much later, so you're stuck with rougher weaves. The colors? Mostly undyed, giving you that natural grayish-brown palette. Fashion statement: I work 12 hours in the field, and I don't care if I match. You'd blend in perfectly with the dirt under your feet. But practicality had its perks. These clothes were loose, airy, and easy to patch. You look down at your sleeves and notice a dozen mismatched repairs, like an ancient quilt stitched onto your daily outfit. Each patch tells a story: the time you tore a sleeve hauling water, the day your tunic snagged on a plow, the week you couldn't afford new fabric. Peasant clothing was a living diary, written in thread. Sandals or bare feet completed the look. Straw sandals were cheap to make but wore out quickly, you'd be lucky to keep them intact through one planting season. So most of the time, you just walked barefoot, developing calluses thick enough to double as armor. Forget pedicures, your feet were tools, as tough as the hoes you used in the fields. Quirky tidbit: some farmers supposedly tied amulets or little cloth charms into their belts, believing these talismans could protect their harvest from bad weather or pests. Imagine trudging through mud with a lucky bean pod dangling at your waist. Practical? Not really. Comforting? Absolutely. Of course, clothing also reflected social rank, even among peasants. A slightly wealthier villager might dye their hemp tunic with indigo, giving it a faded blue hue. The village headman might even afford a cotton robe once that fabric became common, showing he wasn't just anyone, he was slightly less itchy than the rest of you. You shuffle past such figures and feel the small hierarchy stitched into every fiber. Seasons forced constant adjustments. In summer, thin hemp shirts hung loose, exposing arms and legs to sun and mosquito bites. You swat at imaginary bugs buzzing around your neck and wonder how people survived without bug spray. In winter, peasants layered on whatever they could find, quilted cotton if available, but often just stuffed hemp jackets padded with scraps of wool, straw, or even paper. You imagine yourself rustling like a walking fire hazard every time you move. Historians still argue whether straw-stuffed coats were common in some regions or just rare improvisations, but either way, you're not exactly runway ready. Children's clothing in peasant households often mirrored adult wear: small tunics, little pants with open seats for easy bathroom trips, and charms sewn into collars for protection. You watch a toddler toddle by with a tiger-faced bib meant to scare away evil spirits. It's adorable, and possibly effective, depending on whether spirits scare easily. Life for women revolved around making and mending these clothes. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, and patching were endless cycles. You sit beside a loom, listening to the creak and thunk as threads turn into rough fabric. Hours blur into days, days into months. Each bolt of cloth is precious, too valuable to waste. A single ripped sleeve might be patched again and again until it becomes more patch than sleeve. Fast fashion? Not in this world. Every thread was slow, deliberate, and labor-intensive. Despite their plainness, peasant clothes carried quiet dignity. Festivals allowed for small bursts of color, a red sash tied at the waist, a bright ribbon borrowed from a neighbor, or flowers tucked into hair. Imagine the thrill of pulling out your one nice garment, maybe an indigo-dyed tunic, saved for New Year's or a wedding. You slip it on and suddenly feel transformed, even if it's still hemp scratching at your skin. Quirky fringe fact: some records describe farmers wearing short trousers made of leaves or bark fiber in emergencies when cloth was too expensive. Basically, you're in prehistoric cargo shorts, rustling like a tree every time you walk. Not exactly stylish, but hey, zero cost, eco-friendly, fully biodegradable. Ancient sustainable fashion at its finest. Compared to nobles and scholars, peasants' wardrobes might seem dull, but there's something refreshingly honest about them. Every frayed hem told of survival, every patch testified to endurance. These weren't clothes meant to impress gods or emperors. They were made to till the earth, carry firewood, and raise children. You look at your rough tunic again, stained with imaginary sweat and dust, and realize this was the true uniform of China, not dragon robes, but humble hemp. Historians still argue how much creativity peasants had with colors and patterns. Some say dyes were rare luxuries, others point to archaeological finds suggesting that even common folks experimented with earthy tones when they could. The truth is probably somewhere in between, drab most of the time, but a splash of blue or red when fortune allowed. As the sun sets, you tug your patched tunic tighter and feel the day's exhaustion woven into it. You hear the creak of straw sandals on the dirt path, the hum of a loom from a neighbor's hut, the crackle of a fire where more hemp thread waits to be spun. There's no crown on your head, no silk at your wrist, but there's survival stitched into every seam. And in this world, survival was the highest form of fashion. You look down now, and instead of rough hemp sleeves or heavy armor, you see tiny arms slipping through miniature gowns. Children's clothing in ancient China was its own curious category, part practical, part protective, part deeply superstitious. You crouch to tie the sash of a little tunic, and suddenly you're immersed in the world of charms, bright fabrics, and designs meant as much to fool spirits as to clothe a child. For infants, clothing often took the form of simple wraps or small gowns, loose and comfortable for swaddling. Hemp and cotton were the usual fabrics, soft if you were lucky, scratchy if you weren't. You lift a bundle and realize the cloth is easy to wash, because babies in any era are, let's just say, unpredictable. One quirky tidbit: baby trousers were often made with an open seat in the back, no need for diapers. That design lasted well into later centuries, and you can imagine the convenience, as long as you stayed alert to avoid sudden surprises on the floor. But children's clothes weren't just about ease. Parents feared spirits, demons, and bad luck, so clothing doubled as protection. A toddler might wear a dudu, a small, apron-like garment tied around the chest, often embroidered with symbols of health, longevity, or good fortune. You run your fingers over a stitched peach, representing immortality, and realize it's not decoration, it's a spiritual shield. Historians still argue whether these aprons were purely symbolic or also practical undergarments, but the effect was the same: every thread whispered a parent's prayer. Hats and headwear were especially important. Babies often wore tiger hats, little caps with fierce tiger faces embroidered on the front and ears sticking up at the sides. The logic? If a child looked like a tiger, evil spirits would think twice before approaching. You imagine a chubby toddler toddling toward you, growling with felt fangs on their forehead, and try not to laugh. Cute and terrifying at once. Bright colors were common in children's clothing. While adults stuck to muted shades, unless wealthy, kids were often dressed in red, yellow, or green, colors believed to attract positive energy and scare away harm. You pull a scarlet tunic over a giggling child's head and watch them shine like a lantern in the dusk. Unlike peasants' neutral tones, these bursts of color stood out in the crowd, little beacons of life and hope. Accessories played their role too. Children wore necklaces with lock-shaped pendants called longevity locks. The belief was simple but powerful: lock the child's life in place so it couldn't be stolen by spirits. You hold one of these charms in your hand, solid silver, etched with tiny characters, and it feels like a protective key hung right over the heart. Some kids also wore bracelets with bells, jingling as they moved. You listen to the tinkling sound and realize it wasn't just playful, it was meant to let spirits know, this child is already guarded. Quirky fringe detail, some parents deliberately dressed their children in patched or ugly clothes, even if they could afford better. The idea was to trick jealous spirits into ignoring the child. A toddler in a ragged tunic looked unimportant, safe from supernatural envy. Imagine putting your kid in shabby hand-me-downs on purpose, just to convince ghosts they weren't worth the bother. As children grew older, their clothing marked milestones. At age 15 for boys and 13 for girls, coming-of-age ceremonies introduced new garments. A boy might put on his first adult cap, while a girl might receive her first elaborate hairpin. Before that, though, kids' outfits were simplified versions of adult wear, tunics tied with sashes, trousers or skirts, layered as needed for warmth. You watch a group of village children running barefoot, their sleeves flapping like banners, and it feels timeless. Of course, practicality always lingered. Winter meant quilted jackets stuffed with cotton or wool if available, while summer allowed bare arms and legs. Kids wore hand-me-downs until the fabric nearly dissolved, stitched and re-stitched until the garments were more patched than cloth. You tug at a sleeve and see 3 layers of repairs, a history of growth literally sewn into it. Historians still argue whether ornate embroidery on children's clothes was widespread among common folk or mainly reserved for wealthier families. Some say only nobles could afford silk thread and elaborate tiger hats, while peasants stuck to plain hemp. Others suggest that even poor families made the effort, scraping together bright scraps of cloth for the sake of protection. After all, when your child's safety seemed to depend on how fierce their hat looked, you didn't cut corners. The sensory details of children's fashion are vivid. You hear the jingling bells on bracelets, smell the faint herbal scent of sachets tied around waists to ward off illness, and feel the tug of a small hand adjusting their too big sleeves. You see flashes of red, orange, and yellow darting through courtyards as kids play, laughter blending with the rattle of amulets. The clothing is less about beauty and more about comfort, superstition, and survival. And yet, within this, you sense joy. Parents may have worried about demons, but they also wanted their children to shine. A little girl twirls in her red doo-doo, ribbons flying. A boy grins under his crooked tiger hat, eyes glinting with mischief. In their clothes, you see a blend of practicality and play, love and fear, woven into every stitch. By the time the children tumble to the ground, exhausted from chasing each other, their charms clink softly, their patched tunics crumple, and their tiger hats slip sideways. You realize that in ancient China, childhood wasn't dressed in silk or jade, but in protective symbols, colorful scraps, and the ever-present hope that the smallest lives would grow safely into larger ones. You straighten up now, and the tiny tiger hats of children give way to the sweeping elegance of women's clothing across dynasties. From rough hemp skirts to embroidered silks that shimmer like liquid sunlight, women's fashion in ancient China was never just about looking pretty, it was about identity, duty, status, and sometimes, rebellion. You pull a layered robe over your shoulders, tie its sash, and step into the centuries-long catwalk of history. Let's start with the Han Dynasty, where women often wore long robes with wide sleeves, sashes tied high around the waist, and skirts flowing to the floor. These garments weren't stitched to fit tight but to drape, giving the illusion of grace even when you were just carrying water buckets. You take a step and feel the fabric sweep across the ground, like you're gliding. Historians still argue whether Han women deliberately elongated sleeves to emphasize elegance or simply because fabric was plentiful, but either way, swishing sleeves became a kind of performance. Fast forward to the Tang Dynasty, and things explode into color and confidence. Women's robes, called ruchuan, often featured high-waisted skirts, low-cut bodices, and light silk shawls draped over arms. You pull on a Tang-style gown, and suddenly your neckline dips far lower than you expected. Scandalous? Not really. This was a period of bold fashion, where women displayed curves proudly and even painted floral patterns on their foreheads. Quirky tidbit, some Tang ladies supposedly used small patches of gold leaf as face decoration. Imagine walking around with literal bling stuck to your cheeks, talk about glow-up. The Song dynasty dialed things back, favoring simpler, more modest styles. Dresses had narrower sleeves, longer jackets, and muted colors. You slip into one and instantly feel more restrained, like the fabric itself is reminding you to behave. The look reflects the era's values, more about scholarship and order than flamboyance. Gone were the plunging necklines of Tang court dancers. Instead, elegance was quiet, precise, almost understated, like an academic footnote turned into fabric. By the Ming dynasty, women's fashion had grown heavier, more layered. Picture thick brocaded robes embroidered with phoenixes, clouds, and peonies. Collars stiffened, shoulders broadened, and accessories multiplied. You turn sideways and realize you're now practically a walking embroidery display. A phoenix climbs one sleeve, a lotus blossoms on the other, and gold thread glimmers with every move. Wearing one of these robes feels like carrying an entire art gallery on your body. And then came the Qing dynasty with its Manchu-inspired styles. The famous qipao, a fitted dress with high collar and side slits, emerged here, though it looked different from today's sleek modern version. Early qipaos were loose, long, and layered, more practical than Hollywood's tight-fitting glamour shots. You step into one and find it dignified, regal, but not exactly dance-friendly. Historians still argue whether the modernized qipao of the 20th century counts as a direct descendant or a reinterpretation, but the line of continuity remains. Hair and accessories were crucial parts of women's fashion. In some eras, hairstyles reached dramatic heights, padded with hairpieces and held with elaborate pins. You balance one towering style and feel like a walking skyscraper. Quirky detail, Tang women sometimes used bird feathers, flowers, or even miniature figurines as decorations. You lean forward, and a tiny jade parrot threatens to tumble from your bun. Beautiful, but probably hazardous in a windstorm. Every dynasty carried its own rules of propriety. Too much skin in one era could be bold fashion, in another, disgraceful. Too much color could make you look arrogant, too little could make you seem dull. Clothing whispered messages, sometimes louder than words. A scarlet sash might scream, married, while a pale robe might murmur, mourning. Women navigated these codes carefully, aware that the wrong sleeve in the wrong hall might spark gossip, or worse. Of course, not all women had the same choices. Elite women displayed embroidered silks, jewels, and painted brows. Peasant women wore patched skirts and aprons stained from cooking or weaving. But even the humblest might tuck a flower into her hair or stitch a lucky symbol into her sleeve. The desire to express beauty and identity was universal, even if the canvas was smaller. Clothing also played into gender roles. Wide sleeves and trailing skirts limited quick movements, signaling refinement but also restriction. You try to run in a heavy Ming robe and nearly trip over your hem. These garments weren't designed for sprinting, they were designed to emphasize calm, deliberate grace. Was it fashion, or was it subtle control? Historians still argue whether certain designs reflected women's agency or male-dominated ideals of femininity. The truth probably weaves somewhere between. Despite restrictions, women used clothing as subtle rebellion. Some cut sleeves narrower than etiquette demanded, or dyed fabrics in unconventional hues, pushing against social norms. You imagine a Song dynasty girl stitching a forbidden bright red hem onto her otherwise plain jacket, a tiny but defiant splash of personality. Fashion, after all, has always been a quiet language of resistance. The sensory world of women's fashion is unforgettable. Silk glides across your skin like cool water. Brocade presses heavy and warm against your shoulders. The scent of perfumed sachets lingers at your waist, mingling with faint smoke from incense. Jewelry clinks softly as you lift your sleeve to pour tea. Every movement becomes choreography, every gesture framed by fabric. And so, across centuries, women's clothing in ancient China reflected shifting tides of culture, from bold Tang confidence to scholarly Song modesty, from Ming opulence to Qing restraint. You glance at your layered robe and realize it carries more than color or thread, it carries stories of freedom, control, artistry, and survival. By the time you untie your sash and let the fabric pool at your feet, you understand, women's fashion wasn't just about style. It was about navigating the rules of the world, weaving individuality into conformity, and leaving a trace of the self in every stitch. You shake off the layered phoenix robes, and now the focus shifts to men standing stiffly in court, robes cinched tight, collars high, sleeves wide, every fold whispering status. Men's fashion in ancient China wasn't about wild experiments, sorry, no plunging Tang bodices here. Instead, it was about hierarchy. You tug at the stiff lapels of an official's robe, feeling the fabric remind you of exactly where you stand, or don't stand, in the grand scheme of things. In early dynasties like the Han, men wore long tunics with crossed collars, secured with belts or sashes. The look was practical yet dignified, suitable for both scholars and officials. You knot your sash and feel how the robe drapes with deliberate modesty, sleeves wide enough to swallow your hands. The silhouette says, "I'm calm, learned, and definitely not hauling manure today." Historians still argue whether the collar's leftover right fold had symbolic origins or was simply practical tailoring, but its consistency made it a cultural anchor for centuries. By the Tang dynasty, male fashion gained some flair. Robes became looser, colors brighter, belts ornamented. Court officials strutted in garments dyed vermilion or green, depending on their rank. You pull on a bright crimson robe, glance in a mirror of polished bronze, and immediately feel the weight of authority, plus the pressure of not spilling tea on it. Quirky tidbit, some belts featured ornate plaques of gold or jade that doubled as status symbols and conversation starters. Imagine flashing your blinged-out belt buckle during a court meeting, like ancient flex culture. The Song dynasty dialed things back into formality. Simpler lines, darker colors, narrower sleeves, ideal for a scholar class obsessed with refinement and restraint. You try one on, and it feels subdued, like the clothing equivalent of a library whisper. Gone are the flamboyant Tang hues, in their place, muted blues, blacks, and whites that said, "I belong to the world of books." The scholar official's robe became iconic, projecting virtue over vanity. Of course, vanity never really disappears, men still competed over the fineness of their fabric, even if they pretended otherwise. By the Ming dynasty, men's robes grew more structured. Officials wore round-collared robes often adorned with square embroidered patches called buzi, each featuring animals symbolizing their rank. A crane for civil officials, a lion for military ones. You pin a crane patch to your chest, and suddenly everyone knows you're a bureaucrat, not a battlefield hero. Handy if you wanted to avoid being mistaken for the guy who actually had to fight. Quirky fringe fact, some officials apparently bribed tailors to embroider higher-ranking animals than they deserved. Ancient resume padding, stitched directly into your outfit. The Qing dynasty changed the game. With Manchu rulers in charge, men's clothing shifted toward long gowns, changpao, and jackets with horsehoof cuffs that curved inward. You slip one on and realize those cuffs make it hard to wash dishes or chop vegetables. But that was the point, they signaled you weren't doing manual labor. Paired with the iconic Q hairstyle, a shaved forehead with a long braid at the back, Qing male fashion carried unmistakable political weight. Historians still argue whether the enforced hairstyle was a tool of cultural control or simply a practical military style adopted widely, but either way, it left a strong mark. Throughout all dynasties, color and fabric shouted your rank before you even opened your mouth. Yellow silk. Reserved for the emperor, don't even think about it unless you like living dangerously. Certain shades of red, blue, and green indicated official levels. The average man stuck with hemp, cotton, or plain silk, depending on his means. You glance down at your robe and realize it's less about taste and more about legality. Wear the wrong color, and suddenly fashion becomes a capital crime. Yet, despite restrictions, men found ways to personalize. The cut of a sleeve, the knot of a sash, the design of a belt plaque, small details whispered individuality. You tug your belt tighter, adjust the angle of your cap, and feel that subtle rebellion. After all, even in a world where conformity ruled, no one liked looking exactly like the guy standing next to them. Quirky detail: some court officials wore stiff black hats with wings so wide they brushed against their neighbors. Supposedly, this discouraged gossip, but you can imagine the awkward shoulder bumps every time someone shifted. Court must have looked like a flock of stiff-winged birds nodding in unison. Fashion as social engineering, equal parts genius and ridiculous. The sensory details of men's clothing are subtle but sharp. Silk robes whisper as you walk across polished tiles. The embroidered patch on your chest scratches faintly against your skin. The wide sleeves catch the faint scent of incense as you bow. You adjust your stiff hat, sweat pooling under its band, and realize, you're carrying an entire system of governance on your shoulders, stitched into cloth. Historians still argue whether the rigidity of men's fashion reflected genuine cultural values or was just a top-down way to enforce order. Was the narrow palette of song robes an expression of restraint, or a state-mandated uniformity? Did embroidered rank patches inspire pride, or anxiety about scrutiny? Like most debates, the truth probably weaves between control and self-expression. By the time you slip out of your robe and untie its sash, you feel a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Without it, you're just another man. With it, you're a cog in the machinery of empire, visible proof of hierarchy, tradition, and order. Men's fashion in ancient China wasn't flamboyant, but it was powerful. Every fold, every patch, every hat was a reminder: clothes didn't just make the man, they placed him exactly where the world expected him to be. You step away from the rigid court halls, where embroidered patches and stiff hats tell you who outranks whom, and drift into a quieter space. The air here smells of sandalwood and resin, smoke curling in delicate ribbons. Monks, priests, and shamans move silently through the haze, their garments whispering messages not of bureaucracy but of heaven and earth. In religious settings, clothing was never just fabric, it was a portable altar, a spell, a sermon stitched into folds. You kneel for a moment and let the incense soak your sleeves, noticing how different they feel compared to the crisp austerity of court robes. Buddhist monks, for instance, wrapped themselves in kasaya, patchwork robes made of rectangular panels. Traditionally, they were said to be stitched together from discarded rags, dyed earthy yellows, oranges, or browns to signal humility. You clutch the robe's rough seams and feel the reminder of renunciation, though later dynasties often substituted fine silks for those rags. Yes, even vows of poverty got a glow-up when donors wanted to earn merit points. Quirky fact: some wealthy patrons donated robes literally embroidered with gold thread, making the monk inside look like a gilded lampshade. Historians still argue whether this contradicted the Buddhist ideal of detachment or whether it was a clever way of glorifying the Dharma. Taoist priests, by contrast, favored garments that looked almost like costumes from an opera. You pull on a Taoist robe, and immediately it feels like wearing a living cosmological chart. Wide sleeves, bright colors, and symbols of clouds, cranes, or constellations cover the surface. Some robes were marked with the bagua, the 8 trigrams representing cosmic principles, so when a priest spread his arms, it looked like the universe itself was opening. You shuffle a step and nearly trip over the long trailing hem, realizing that being a celestial mediator came with a tripping hazard. Fringe tidbit: some Taoist robes included hidden talismans sewn into the lining, like magical cheat codes stitched into your outfit. Confucian rituals demanded their own strict dress codes. Scholars performing ancestral rites donned plain, dark robes, often black or deep blue, with little ornamentation. The point wasn't to dazzle but to show sincerity and gravity. You slip one on, and the weight of the cloth feels almost like the weight of family expectations pressing on your shoulders. No jokes here, kid, you're bowing before your ancestors, and wrinkled sleeves might be taken as an insult. Meanwhile, shamans and folk ritual specialists wore clothing that was frankly wild. Tiger skins, bird feathers, rattling bells, and masks all found their way into ritual garb. Imagine trying to scare off a malevolent spirit while dressed in your office robe. It wouldn't work. But put on a feathered cape with a roaring tiger pelt, and suddenly you radiate otherworldly power. You tie a feathered headpiece under your chin, the quills tickling your ears, and feel half ridiculous, half terrifying. Historians still argue whether these costumes were purely symbolic or if their animal elements were thought to literally channel the creature's spirit into the wearer. The sensory details of religious garments are distinct from court clothing. Monks' robes rustle quietly as they sweep temple floors. Taoist silks shimmer like ripples of water under lantern light. The stiff, incense-soaked collars of Confucian ritual robes scratch faintly against your neck as you bow. You imagine the audience's hush as a priest spreads his sleeves and transforms fabric into theater, theology, and spellwork. One quirky detail: some Buddhist monks wore hats shaped like fish tails during ceremonies, reminding them to swim against the current of desire. You balance one of these floppy hats on your head and feel like a character in a surreal cartoon, but the metaphor sticks. Another oddity: Taoist priests sometimes carried handheld fans painted with talismans, using them to sweep away evil influences. Basically, ritual fashion accessories doubled as magical props. The debates about religious clothing run deep. Historians still argue whether Buddhist monks' embrace of silk-laden robes diluted their original vows, or whether it helped the faith spread by aligning with Chinese ideas of dignity. They also question whether Taoist costumes were designed for practical ritual needs or if they were stagecraft to impress the masses. And those feathered shaman outfits? Were they evidence of early animism or simply regional theater? You look down at your sleeves and realize something important: unlike court dress, religious garments weren't just about status, they were about connection. Connection to heaven, to ancestors, to gods, to cosmic patterns too vast to comprehend. Wearing them didn't just place you in a hierarchy, it transformed you into a temporary bridge between worlds. And yet, just like in court, clothing here could make or break you. Wear the wrong robe in the wrong rite, and you risked offending not just an emperor but a deity. Forgetting your feathered headdress during an exorcism? That could mean inviting the spirit to stay for dinner. Misplacing your monk's robe belt? Suddenly, your vow of discipline looked a little sloppy. Fashion faux pas in religious contexts came with stakes far higher than side-eye from a palace official. You bow, sleeves pooling like waves at your knees, and sense the whispers of centuries-old prayers stitched into the hems. The robes are heavy, yes, but in that heaviness lies a certain calm, as if the fabric itself has absorbed countless invocations and now carries them gently forward. You exhale, incense still burning your nostrils, and think, religious garments weren't just worn, they wore the people who put them on. You push open the heavy temple doors and step back into the sun, and with that, the landscape shifts. Dust kicks up around your feet, the sound of camel bells clinks faintly, and before you know it you're trudging the endless roads of trade. The Silk Road is less a single road and more a sprawling web, and you, robe swishing around your ankles, are about to feel how fashion itself traveled these paths like gossip on the wind. At first, Chinese silk was the star. You finger the smooth thread at your sleeve and remember how peasants once tended worms for emperors. But now, those same shimmering bolts are bundled on camelback, headed west toward Persia, Rome, and everywhere in between. Imagine the awe of a Roman noble pulling open a crate and gasping at fabric so fine it seemed woven from sunlight. Quirky tidbit: Roman senators at one point complained that silk was corrupting morals, since it was too transparent. Yes, the first wardrobe scandal was basically about ancient see-through shirts. Historians still argue whether this Roman outrage was genuine morality talk or just politicians grumbling about expensive imports draining the treasury. But the Silk Road wasn't a one-way runway. Fabrics, dyes, and patterns poured back into China, changing how you dressed without you even realizing it. You pause at a bustling oasis market and touch a bolt of Persian brocade. The weaving is thick, jeweled with metallic thread, utterly unlike Chinese silk. Soon, wealthy Chinese elites begin craving these foreign fabrics, sewing them into robes or trimming their collars with imported luxuries. You pull one around your shoulders, and instantly you feel like someone who can afford an entire caravan's ransom. Then there were the colors. Indigo dye from India, saffron from Central Asia, cochineal red from far-off lands. It's as if the Silk Road expanded the painter's palette. You imagine trying on a robe dipped in these brilliant hues, only to have neighbors squint and whisper, "Is that shade even legal here?" Because remember, colors in China weren't just style, they were hierarchy. Historians still argue how strictly these foreign dyes were policed, or if their novelty sometimes let elites bend the rules. And don't forget the patterns. You stroll past stalls lined with cloth covered in Persian floral swirls, Sogdian winged horses, Byzantine crosses. Soon, Chinese robes feature motifs of lions, grapevines, or celestial orbs, images not native to China but absorbed into its fabric culture. A quirky detail. Archaeologists found Tang Dynasty tomb figurines dressed in tunics with Central Asian stripes, looking suspiciously like they were ready for a desert rave. It wasn't just fabric, accessories hitched a ride too. Jewelers carried turquoise, amber, and lapis lazuli across the sands. You slip a lapis bead onto your sash cord, its blue glowing like frozen water in the desert heat. In exchange, Chinese hairpins, combs, and even folding fans reached the hands of far-off aristocrats. Fashion, it seems, has always been the world's most stubborn stowaway. Religious clothing also transformed along the routes. Buddhist monks in China adopted saffron and orange robes partly inspired by Indian traditions, adjusting them with local tailoring. Taoist robes began absorbing motifs from foreign astronomy. Even the stiff black hats of Confucian officials, believe it or not, were influenced by Central Asian cap designs. You try on one with flared wings, and realize you're walking proof that cross-cultural borrowing is older than TikTok trends. Quirky tidbit, in the Tang capital of Chang'an, foreign traders strutted so proudly in their homeland outfits that Chinese nobles began copying them. Men tried out Central Asian tight trousers and boots, scandalously practical compared to flowing robes. Women experimented with Persian tunics and veils. For a brief period, walking through Chang'an looked like scrolling through an international fashion feed, everyone borrowing, remixing, and flaunting. Historians still argue whether these fusions signaled cultural openness or if they sparked pushback from traditionalists horrified by foreignization. The sensory experience of these exchanges is rich. Picture brushing your hand over silk so smooth it squeaks faintly, then over Persian wool so dense it muffles sound. Imagine the scent of indigo vats in a dye shop, the tang of metallic thread heated by the sun. The roads themselves are runways, caravans trailing ribbons of new textures and hues. Of course, not everyone loved the chaos. Some dynasties cracked down on barbarian styles, banning trousers or foreign hats at court. Others, like the Tang, leaned into it, celebrating diversity. You sip from a clay cup of imported wine, sleeves rolled back Persian style, and laugh at the idea that fashion could be contained by borders. It never could, it always slipped through like sand in your boot. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road's fashion impact was mainly elite, luxury fabrics for the wealthy, or whether commoners, too, felt the trickle-down in cheaper imitations. Did the peasant in a hemp tunic dream of wearing stripes like a Sogdian merchant? Or was that cultural cross-pollination mostly reserved for palaces and tombs? The debate lingers, stitched into every fragment dug from desert sands. By the time you reach the far edge of the market, arms full of foreign scarves, you realize something: the Silk Road wasn't just about moving goods, but about moving ideas, aesthetics, and identities. A hemline here, a dye there, and suddenly the look of an entire dynasty shifts. You glance at your robe, patched now with colors and symbols from half the world, and smirk. Fashion is contagious, and this road was history's busiest sneeze. You leave the dusty trade stalls behind, arms still full of fabrics that smell faintly of camel sweat and exotic dye vats, and step into the polished, echoing corridors of the imperial court. Here, the rules of dress are as strict as the laws carved into bronze. You smooth your robe, glance nervously at your sleeves, and hope you're not committing some silent, fashion-based felony. Because at court, clothing wasn't just decoration, it was law, etiquette, and sometimes the difference between promotion and exile. Every dynasty sharpened the blade of dress codes. In the Zhou era, long before silk caravans rolled west, clothing regulations were set down like commandments. Officials were told what length of robe, what shade of sash, what embroidery suited their rank. Fast forward to the Tang, Ming, and Qing, and it's still happening, except now the manuals read like encyclopedias of do's and don'ts. You can almost hear the scratching of brushes on bamboo slips, officials drafting new rules like ancient fashion police reports. You bow as you step into a Ming audience hall, your embroidered busy patch flashing. A crane means you're a civil official, while the guy next to you wears a tiger for military service. The system is so precise that one glance at a chest tells you exactly who's outranking whom. Quirky tidbit: some desperate men tried sewing on patches of higher status animals, basically cosplaying their way to promotions. Imagine getting caught with a unicorn stitched on your chest when your real job was junior secretary. Historians still argue whether enforcement was strict across all provinces, or if local officials often turned a blind eye in exchange for bribes. Then there's color. You eye the shimmering golden robe across the hall, it belongs to the emperor, and only the emperor. Yellow silk was so restricted that even a hint of it on your belt cord could mean death. You pull your own sleeve close, relieved it's a safe indigo. In the Tang dynasty, even shoes were regulated, certain ranks wore red, others black, others green. By the Qing, it extended to hat decorations. Different colored beads on the finial told the world whether you were first-rank nobility or a minor bureaucrat desperately trying to be noticed. Headwear was especially treacherous territory. You balance the stiff black, winged hat of a Song official, its outstretched flaps brushing your neighbor. Supposedly, the wings were designed to keep you from leaning into gossip during meetings. You imagine the scene, an entire hall of men nodding solemnly, their hats knocking like awkward birds. Of course, quirky rumor says some officials trimmed the wings shorter so they could whisper anyway. Rule breaking by millimeters. Etiquette didn't stop at what you wore, it extended to how you wore it. Sleeves had to be held just so when bowing. Belts tied at the correct height, collars folded left over right, never reversed. You tug at your knot nervously, hoping it won't slide down. A scholar once wrote that improper sleeve length could disturb the harmony of ritual. In other words, forget a fashion faux pas, your robe could cause cosmic imbalance. No pressure. The stakes could be deadly serious. There are records of officials punished, even executed, for wearing colors or symbols above their station. Historians still argue whether these punishments were routine or reserved for dramatic power plays, but either way, you wouldn't want to be the guy caught flaunting yellow at the wrong banquet. Fashion crimes at court weren't laughed off, they were treated like rebellion in silk. And yet, amid the rigidity, small rebellions crept in. Some nobles commissioned robes a shade brighter than the rules allowed, daring others to call them out. Others layered foreign scarves or belts under their official dress, a tiny secret wink at cosmopolitan taste. You shift your robe to reveal a hidden Persian stripe at your inner hem, a little flourish no one can scold you for, unless they catch you mid-stride. Sensory details hammer the lesson home. The swish of hundreds of silk sleeves in unison as the court bows before the throne. The faint squeak of stiff-soled boots against marble floors. The choking warmth of too many layers worn indoors because, well, etiquette demanded full formality no matter the season. You wipe sweat from your brow, hat feathers drooping slightly, and wonder if anyone in history ever dared to say, "Can we make this meeting robe optional?" Quirky tidbit: by the Qing dynasty, officials even wore seasonal court robes with fur-lined edges in winter, and fines could be imposed if they showed up out of season. Imagine HR scolding you for wearing your summer polo in December, but with exile to Siberia as the penalty. Historians still argue about how deeply these codes shaped society. Were they effective tools for maintaining hierarchy, or did they create resentment that simmered under all the silken pomp? Did people internalize them as natural order, or grumble silently as they folded their sleeves just so? The truth, like most seems, is somewhere in between. threads of obedience stitched alongside quiet defiance. By the time you step out of the hall, you're dizzy from the rules. Every fold, every thread, every color meant something, and misstep once, and the court's sharp-eyed attendants might cut your future short. You loosen your sash with a sigh, muttering under your breath that sometimes, too many rules just ruin the fun of clothes. Then again, in the world of emperors and ministers, your wardrobe wasn't about fun. It was about survival, and survival came stitched with perfect seams. You step out of the marble halls where sleeves whispered hierarchy and into the present day, blinking against neon lights. The world around you hums with motorcycles, smartphones, and noodle shops, but, if you look closely, threads of the past still cling. Ancient clothing hasn't vanished, it lingers, reshaped, revived, and reimagined. You tug at the edge of a flowing sleeve and realize, you're standing in a modern Hanfu revival gathering, where young people whirl in garments centuries old yet freshly alive. Hanfu, literally Han clothing, has returned as both fashion and statement. Students, cosplayers, and cultural enthusiasts don silk robes cut like Tang Dynasty gowns, or narrow-sleeved Song jackets, or Ming-style round collars. You watch as someone snaps selfies in a riverside park, their robe fluttering against the wind, while another adjusts a jade hairpin gleaming under LED street lamps. Quirky tidbit, some subway stations in China post reminders that yes, people in elaborate Hanfu are not lost actors, they're just commuters choosing cultural throwback chic. Historians still argue whether this revival is about authentic history or a modern reinvention, stitched together with equal parts nostalgia and national pride. Even beyond Hanfu circles, echoes of the past remain. The Cheongsam, Qipao, with its high collar and side slits, evolved from the Qing Chongpao, blending Manchu heritage with 20th century tailoring. You slip one on and suddenly feel like you've stepped into a 1930s Shanghai jazz club, cigarette smoke curling as silk clings to your figure. Today, the Cheongsam appears everywhere, from weddings to fashion runways, proof that garments born of dynastic decree can become timeless style icons. Then there's the martial arts robe, still seen in kung fu films and Tai Chi practice. You tie its sash, flex your sleeves, and almost kick over a water bottle. The style itself is practical, loose for movement, modest for respect. Modern sports brands even sell polyester versions, an echo of centuries-old tailoring reimagined for gym class. Colors, too, hold their power. Brides slip into crimson gowns for weddings, just as Tang ladies once did, while yellow still carries an aura of authority, even if no emperor will knock on your door to complain about your hoodie. The symbolism of clothing, once life or death, now lingers like perfume, softer, safer, but still there. Quirky detail, some modern Hanfu enthusiasts stage time travel flash mobs, arriving at malls or subway stations dressed in full dynastic gear. Shoppers pause, snap photos, and for a moment it looks like the Silk Road caravan took a wrong turn into Starbucks. Historians still argue whether this movement is more cosplay than continuity, or whether the playful revival might yet solidify into cultural mainstream. Sensory notes shift, too. The whisper of silk remains the same, but now it's mingled with the buzz of escalators. Embroidered dragons still gleam, though under fluorescent light instead of lantern glow. The wide sleeves of a Ming robe trail not over polished marble but onto subway seats sticky with bubble tea. You laugh softly, ancient elegance has learned to dodge spilled tapioca pearls. And yet, beyond nostalgia, modern echoes of Chinese clothing remind you of something enduring. Clothes never stopped being symbols. Then, they told emperors from peasants. Now, they tell identity from identity, I belong to this tradition, I choose this memory, I carry these threads forward. Whether stitched in hemp or polyester, whether worn in ancestral rites or TikTok reels, the fabric still connects past to present. You glance at your reflection in a glass storefront, wide sleeves, embroidered collar, sneakers peeking from underneath. A mix of dynasties and decades, history and now. And you smirk, because fashion always was like that, never frozen, always folding one story into the next. So now, with the weight of robes and sashes set gently aside, let your breathing slow. Picture yourself lying back, no longer crushed beneath court rules or bustling caravans, but resting in fabric light as air. Imagine the faint brush of silk against your skin, a whisper of centuries stitched into every thread. The noisy court fades, the caravan bells fall silent, and even the chatter of modern streets softens to nothing more than a low hum. Around you, sleeves sway like gentle waves, colors blur into twilight, and the air holds the faintest trace of incense and fresh linen. You're wrapped not in hierarchy or duty, but in calm, timeless comfort. Each fold of cloth loosens, each knot unravels, until only ease remains. Clothing that once carried the weight of emperors and rituals now becomes a blanket, simple and soft, warming you against the cool night air. The fabrics of history, coarse hemp, polished silk, embroidered brocade, blend together into something that holds you, steady and safe. Close your eyes, let the seams of time dissolve, and drift gently downward. The stories stay with you, yes, but quieter now, as if the robes themselves are whispering goodnight. And with that, the journey closes, soft as a sleeve brushing your cheek.